sun, was rising over the ancient Nile, its golden light spilling across the river like molten metal. In that soft glow, thousands of years ago, African civilizations were already shaping ideas, traditions, and systems that would ripple through time, far beyond their borders, far beyond the memories of their own descendants. Yet, even today, echoes of those forgotten worlds live in the languages spoken, in the rhythms of the drums, in the patterns of cloth, in the quiet resilience of a people who have endured everything the centuries could throw at them. To understand the soul of modern Africa, you cannot start in the 20th century, or even in the colonial era. You must go far back to the kingdoms, empires, and city-states whose names carry both legend and truth. Civilizations like ancient Egypt, Kush, Axum, Carthage, Mali, Great Zimbabwe. Each was a world unto itself, and each left deep marks on the African identity we know today. Imagine walking into the bustling streets of Thebes. In 1500 BCE, traders from Nubia arrive on the backs of camels and boats, carrying ivory, gold, and incense. Priests chant hymns written in hieroglyphics, a script so complex and beautiful it seems to breathe life into stone. Farmers along the Nile use irrigation systems that will be copied and adapted in other parts of Africa for generations. Even the idea of centralized government, of structured laws and taxation, begins to take shape here. And in the hearts of the people, whether they wore fine linen or simple woven cloth, there was a shared understanding that culture was not just what you made, but what you passed on. To the south, in Nubia, and later Kush, the world was not simply copying Egypt, it was innovating. The Kushite kings ruled over Egypt at one point, blending their own traditions with those of their northern neighbors, their art, their architecture, their iron's melting technology, it all spread outward. The skill of working with iron, born in African soil, would later empower other regions with the tools for farming, hunting, and defense. Even centuries later, when European colonizers arrived, they were astonished to find advanced metallurgy already deeply rooted in African societies. But Africa's ancient story is not just about monumental buildings or weapons, it is about philosophies of life. Take, for example, the city of Axum, in present-day Ethiopia. By the 4th century CE, Axum had not only established a powerful trading empire but also embraced Christianity, making it one of the earliest nations in the world to do so. That faith still flows through the veins of millions of Africans today, intertwined with local traditions in ways that make it uniquely African. Religious festivals like Timket, celebrated in Ethiopia, still carry echoes of rituals that began in Axum's time, rituals that have survived war, famine, and the relentless pull of modernity. The northwestern coast tells another story. Carthage, in present-day Tunisia, was a titan of the ancient world, a center of maritime trade, agriculture, and diplomacy. Though eventually destroyed by Rome, Carthage's agricultural innovations, particularly the use of crop rotation and irrigation, would influence farming practices across North Africa for centuries. These methods didn't vanish. They traveled, adapted, survived in oral tradition, and resurfaced in the everyday lives of farmers thousands of years later. Then, centuries after Carthage's fall, new empires rose in the West. The Mali Empire of the 14th century was so wealthy that the name of its ruler, Mansa Musa, became synonymous with unimaginable riches. But his wealth wasn't just gold, it was culture, knowledge, and art. Under his rule, Timbuktu became a center of learning, where scholars wrote in Arabic on astronomy, medicine, history, and law. These texts, many still preserved today, are proof that Africa was never a dark continent waiting to be enlightened. It was a continent that had been generating light of its own for millennia. Across the southern plains, Great Zimbabwe stood as a marvel of engineering. Massive stone walls built without mortars still stand today, some more than 800 years old. The city's complex social organization, its thriving trade networks that reached as far as China, and its architectural brilliance all challenged the false narratives that African history was somehow static or primitive before European contact. These civilizations did more than survived, they thrived, innovated, and influenced each other. And through centuries of trade, migration, and even conquest, their ideas seeped into the DNA of the continent's culture. Today, when you see kente cloth in Ghana, you are looking at a design tradition that traces its roots back to centuries-old weaving techniques, influenced by both local innovations and cross-continental exchange. When you hear the polyrhythmic drumming of West African music, you are hearing patterns shaped by centuries of cultural layering, from indigenous beats to instruments that traveled along trade routes from North Africa and beyond. Yet, Africa's ancient inheritance was nearly stolen, not by time, but by those who sought to erase it. Colonial powers often rewrote history, downplaying or outright denying Africa's intellectual and cultural achievements. They tore artifacts from their homelands and locked them in foreign museums. They replaced indigenous education systems with colonial curricula designed to make Africans forget their past. And yet, despite this, Africa remembered, sometimes not in written records, but in stories told at the fireside, in the rhythm of the talking drum, in the careful passing down of names and proverbs that carried the wisdom of the ages. That survival was no accident, it was resistance. When enslaved Africans were forced across the Atlantic, they carried fragments of their heritage in memory and practice. Those fragments, blended with new realities, gave rise to the spirituals, dances, and community traditions that would go on to shape the Black experience in the Americas. You can still hear the calandrus ponds singing, the syncopated rhythms, the storytelling styles, living fossils of ancient African cultural DNA. Modern African cultures, whether in bustling cities or rural villages, are mosaics made from thousands of years of inherited wisdom. The communal values putting community before self, respecting elders, honoring ancestors are philosophies that predate colonization and continue to thrive today. Even political systems, such as the Gokaka courts in Rwanda, which emphasize restorative justice, have their roots in pre-colonial African traditions. But perhaps the greatest inheritance is not any one practice or belief, but the unbreakable spirit of cultural continuity. That spirit has endured slavery, colonization, and globalization, and yet remains vibrant. It is in the languages, over 2,000 of them, still spoken across the continent. It is in the food jollof rice injera, fufu, whose recipes carry whispers of ancient trade and migration. It is in the ceremonies birth, marriage, harvests that continue to bind communities together. And so, when we look at modern African cultures, we are not seeing something new in isolation. We are seeing the latest chapter in a story thousands of years old, the story that began with empires on the Nile, kings in the savannah, traders on the Red Sea, and stonemasons in the highlands. A story that continues to be told, not just in books, but in every market, every dance, every prayer, and every song that rises from the heart of Africa. The night in Dakar is alive with rhythm. In the streets, you hear the Sabar drums echoing against the walls, their beats weaving a language older than the city itself. Young dancers spin and leap, their bodies telling stories they've never read in book, stories passed through motion, preserved in muscle memory from ancestors who danced in the courts of kings and in the fields of survival. They may not name the empires that birthed these rhythms, but the spirit is still there, pulsing in every strike of the drum. This is how history survives, not always in monuments or manuscripts, but in living, breathing bodies. The modern African story is full of these threads, ancient strands, woven into new cloth. In Ghana, the use of Adinkra symbols on textiles and architecture speaks a visual language that began long before colonization. Each symbol carries layers of meaning: courage, unity, endurance, the supremacy of God. Today, they appear not just in ceremonies, but on school walls, official emblems, and even in street art. What began as sacred royal iconography now inspires youth movements calling for accountability, justice, and progress. Topia, the Gia script first, carved into stone in the Axumite, remains in use for liturgical texts. Its survival is more than linguistic continuity. It is an act of cultural sovereignty. Each time a child learns to read those ancient letters, they inherit a connection to ancestors who saw writing as a divine gift. They carry forward a memory that colonizers could not erase, a testament that African knowledge systems were never dependent on Europe for legitimacy. The influence is just as visible in governance. Across the continent, traditional systems of community-based, justice-rooted in pre-colonial African customs are resurfacing in modern legal frameworks. In South Africa, the philosophy of Ubuntu, which emphasizes humanity, interconnectedness, and restorative justice, draws directly from Bantu traditions stretching back centuries. When Nelson Mandela invoked Ubuntu during the nation's transition from apartheid, he was not introducing something new, he was reawakening something ancient. The idea that I am because we are still guides, reconciliation programs, conflict resolution, code, and even how families resolve disputes in villages far from the reach of formal courts. In Senegal and Mali, griotsural historians still sing the genealogies of families, the victories of past kings, the lessons of old battles. These are not dusty legends. They are active tools of identity. In a world saturated with imported media, griots remind communities of their own epic history, giving children a heritage of pride in place of shame. They connect the young to the idea that their bloodline is not defined by colonial borders, but by centuries of creativity, courage, and resilience. But the legacy of ancient civilizations is not only about preservation, it is also about transformation in the face of injustice. During the colonial era, African intellectuals and revolutionaries consciously drew on their deep history to inspire resistance. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana invoked the grandeur of Mali and Songhai to rally Pan-African unity. In the Caribbean and the Americas, leaders of the Black Liberation Movement pointed to Egypt, Kush, and Ethiopia as proof that African people had always built great nations, that they were not starting from nothing. These historical references were a shield against the colonial lie that Africa's story began with slavery. Even in the most oppressive conditions, fragments of the old ways endured. Enslaved Africans in the Americas adapted spiritual practices that drew on multiple African traditions: Yoruba, Igbo, Congo, and blended them with the new worlds they were forced kin to. The result was a vibrant cultural resistance. Music like blues and jazz, with deep African rhythmic roots. Religions like and carrying the names and attributes of African deities. Storytelling patterns that mirrored those of the griots. These were not relics, they were living proofs that history could cross oceans and survive captivity. Today, African cities are cultural crossroads where ancient legacies meet global modernity. In Lagos, you can see fashion designers incorporating beadwork and fabric patterns that trace back to centuries-old Yoruba court attire. In Nairobi, hip-hop artists weave Swahili proverbs, echoes of East African trade history into lyrics about corruption, poverty, and hope. In Cape Town, street murals depict African queens, warriors, and gods alongside modern activists, creating a visual dialogue between past and present. This reclaiming of heritage is not without struggle. The wounds of colonial exploitation are deep. European museums still hold stolen African artifacts, bronze plaques from Benin, statues from Ife, manuscripts from Timbuktu. Many of these objects are more than art, they are historical archives, religious tools, and cultural anchors. Their absence is a silent theft, depriving generations of Africans of direct access to their own history. Yet the movement to repatriate these treasures is growing, fueled by a new generation who understand that dignity and justice require not just political sovereignty, but cultural sovereignty too.